here we are down to our transmission case and basically its contents. I think the next thing I'd like to do is drain the oil. I suppose that's a good idea first. And then pop off this back cover back here. That's going to allow me to get a look at the ring gear unit, probably the pinion as well. There's a bunch of gears and shafts inside this forward component. There's a pinion that ends here that meshes with the ring gear, which drives our finals. Sometimes those can be compromised, so I'm eager to see how they look. I think I'd also at some point like to set something up where I can spin our input shaft around and get a feel for how the gears mesh with one another, if there's any excessive noise. These gears in these transmissions are a straight cut gear. There's no synchronization. Basically, with enough time and wear against one another, you can have the result of a transmission with a whine or a growl to it, some noise. And that could be bad bearings or other things too. But if the gears are worn, you'll sometimes have that howl as you're moving around, which is kind of unpleasant to deal with. So if there's any of that, I'd like to get ahead of it and swap out the compromised parts with some good ones. I know you'll be shocked to hear that I've got a couple parts transmissions if I need to get to them for that purpose. Yeah, I think we'll see about draining some oil here and taking a peek. I can't wait to see what's inside. To drain our oil, we're going to pull the oil plug. This guy here is there's a little bit of a spring and a ball that fits in here that puts tension on our power takeoff lever, so that's not your drain plug. That guy there is. Should be some thicker stuff that should be coming out here. Oh yeah. And while that oil trickles out of there, I think we'll go ahead and buzz out our group of 9/16 bolts. I'm just going to hold this back cover on. Alright, I know everybody's admiring how stable this whole thing is up here, so I think what I'm going to do is reset our transmission. Now we're all stable. Our PTO shaft is going to stay in place, but the rest of this cover, if I give it a little tap with the hammer, will want to come out. There's a dowel pin here. I'm sure there's one down there. So now we just have to work our seal's going to hold a little snug on the PTO shaft, but this should just all work out nicely. Getting our first look at our ring gear in there. First couple teeth look okay, but if I spin this guy around, I don't see any major gouges or chips out of the ring gear teeth. And when we get to putting things back together, there's a little bit of it's called a backlash measurement. You can kind of hear the teeth kind of clicking against each other there. We're going to have to reset all that because we're going to put all new bearings both in the pinion and then in these retainers on each side for the differential. While we're in here, we might as well. those flanges removed, we should be able to roll our ring gear right out of the back. And get a good look. Now, when I first pulled that rear cover off, transmission case, I was optimistic that I didn't see any big chips in the teeth of the ring gear. But as we get it out, there's definitely some wear to the teeth on each side, really. Down here as well on this side. And whether if I decide to switch this out, I'm going to have to get a whole different set, pinion and ring gear, because these are matched to each other. I do have a couple other transmissions I can tear apart if I've got one that's a little better looking. We may just do that. If not, we'll work with what we've got. For now, we'll keep digging. I'm going to go ahead and take the shifter quadrant off, see what the gears and such looks like inside the forward part of the case. Okay, we're going to lift our shifter quadrant off of here and see what kind of ugly lives down in our transmission. No broken gears yet. Let's take a closer look. Thought I'd do a little transmission 101, kind of show you how some of this stuff works inside the transmission case. Got our shifter quadrant, which sits on top of the transmission, and by moving our gear selector, it moves these forks from underneath, which in turn will slide these gears back and forth on the pinion shaft. And when these gears are slid back and forth, they will mesh in either with the input shaft or a cluster gear on the power takeoff shaft, and that will give power to the pinion to run the final drives. To show how the input shaft works, I've kind of hooked this little drill up to spin, and see it turning in there. That would essentially be with the tractor in neutral. If we take one of our gears and slide it the way our shifter fork will do, we'll put it in third gear. Then we can see the pinion move in addition to the input shaft. Not that you can really see, but third gear, fourth gear, fifth gear, first, reverse, second. Important part to pay attention to on this input shaft is the teeth on the back of the shaft. That's essentially your second gear. These can sometimes get chipped or worn. This one doesn't seem too bad. Pretty good. And of course, reverse should turn our pinion opposite direction. So here again is second gear. So reverse should turn the opposite, which it does. There's a large cluster gear down inside on the PTO shaft that works to help with some gear reduction. The first step of our disassembly is going to involve the removal of this front cover. Under this front cover are two gears, and they are gears that run our power takeoff, or PTO. The top gear is hollow, and the input shaft rides inside of it. Then there's a bottom gear that splines in with a coupling that will ultimately power the power takeoff shaft. So there's 5 Allen head bolts we're going to take out and pull this cover outward. So we've got our 5 bolts removed, but before I can slide this cover and gear off the housing over the input shaft, I have to take this coupling out. We're going to do that by pounding out the pin that holds this coupling onto the input shaft. And this is a kind of an important spot to take a look at to see how your splines on your input shaft look, because our coupling on there, there's not a lot of wiggle or play. I've seen some of these input shafts that really get a lot of wear to the splines. That's just asking for a failure or a transmission issue down the road if there's an excessive amount of wear in that spot. So now with that, we ought to be able to tap our cover off. Under this cover is a bearing cup that seats into the cone bearing on our power shaft gear, so this should be able just to come off without having to remove this at this point in time. There is a gasket between this cover and the transmission case. Just want to be careful not to crack our casting. There we have it. Still a little residual oil in there, but there's our case removed. We can see this top power takeoff drive gear that meshes with this bottom power takeoff drive gear. And because I've removed the holding surface for our bearing cone, we're going to have some play in that at this point in time. Done a little bit of cleanup. We're going to enlist the services of our little gear puller here once again in an attempt to try and pull this front gear off of our power takeoff shaft. And this should pop off of here fairly easily. All right. Inside this gear are two roller bearings. I don't know if you can see them in there. We'll inspect those and see how they work, how they look as well. We pull this gear because that's going to give us some clearance when we go to pull the input shaft off. You might notice there are other tapped holes on this transmission case. Those are for transmissions that do not have live power takeoff. You'll have a cover that screws on covering this bolt for the pinion. You'll have a bearing quill for our power takeoff shaft here. So that's why we see holes that are there, just for a different option. To remove our pinion shaft from the transmission case, we need to tap out this little cotter key. Now this is an 1 1/8" nut to keep our shaft from turning while we try to remove the nut. We're going to take two gears and engage the gears so that's not going to turn when we go to take it out. Got our washer, got our nut, got our first cone bearing here. Okay. The pinion shaft is now going to slide backwards out through the transmission. And I think I can rotate our table so you may be able to see it back here. As I pull it backwards, as I do this, the gears are going to, one by one, slide off as well. Starting with third and fourth gear. Also got that little spacer, that little shim spacer there, important to keep as far as paying attention to. First and fifth gear. Second and reverse, and then our pinion itself. So now the input shaft. Input shaft, we're going to remove this front quill, this cover that holds the bearing and such up in there. If I'm being honest, I don't know what size this Allen head is. It's kind of been the same for both that PTO cover and these little guys. Under this bearing quill, there's going to be a bunch of shims, and those shims are going to be important to setting our preload on our bearings later, our bearing load. That little guy's got a little bearing in him. Pay attention to that. Our little set of shims. Now we ought to be able to take our input shaft, move him forward, and get him up out like so. Nice input shaft. Now with all the other bits removed, we should be able to now remove our power shaft, and can do so by tapping it forward out of the transmission case. There's a bearing back in the back of the case here that prevents it from going backwards. That may free it up. There we are. We have a lip there. There we are. Our takeoff shaft. This may vary, this particular shaft, from model to tractor, based on whether it's live PTO or not, depending on the model. A utility is going to be shorter, the standard is going to have the longer end. I think a tricycle is going to be longer still. So this is kind of particular to this particular model tractor. Down in our case, we have the coupling for the power takeoff engaging. Another spacer. We've got the cluster gear, aforementioned, that has these two roller bearings inside of it. And I believe this spacer goes in there as well. Another spacer for the back, and then the bearing that was on the back of that shaft. One happy gear sandwich. So we are nearly down to a bare transmission case. To get there, I'm going to go ahead and remove the power takeoff fork lever from the case. I'm also going to tap out all of these bearing cups that we have on the outside here, and then there's 3 on the inside. At the upper input shaft, there's actually a seal up there that's behind that top cone, top cup. The big one, it's to our left, has some shims behind it. Those are going to be important to retain, and we're going to use those later when we set our bearing spacing with the new drive pinion. When we put it in place, there's some measurements we have to make using those shims, so we'll be careful not to damage those when we tap them out. Here's our big bearing cup, one set of our shims. I believe there's going to be, yeah, there's more shims still up in there. These, like I said, these are going to be important later when we go to set the depth of our pinion in there. So now we get to go clean up all this oil. As we are cleaning up our transmission case, one area, if you're going to go this far, that's worth pointing out is this little oil galley that runs from back to the front. The second gear on our input shaft, as it spins around, flings oil up this little cup, which will catch it, and it runs down, comes out this little opening here to lube the front bearing of our input shaft. Sometimes you can even kind of see it down in that front corner. Get a little sample out of there. You'll get little bits of material up in there, little chunks of metal and such that, yeah, you don't want to have that. If we're putting new bearings in, you don't want to have that stuff up in there. So we're going to pay extra close attention to cleaning that out. And I know it's a bit awkward as I'm holding the camera and trying to, there's a nice big chunk right there. You can see me pulling that out of there. Ooh, yeah, not the kind of stuff we want in new bearings. So pay attention to that if you're going this far, and give that a good clean out. I'm not messing with our transmission disassembly. We're going to go ahead and pull the bearings and then the fixed gears from our input shaft. Each gear is separate on this shaft. There's a keyway that keeps it locked in place. This gear here rotates on some bearings on the inside, and that'll slide off once we have these three. But first we got to pull this bearing here. To do that, and utilize a little bearing puller. And I'm going to take it over to the press. We'll see if we can't pop him off. Set up on the press with our bearing puller tucked under the bearing. Pressure down on the shaft, hopefully pushing the bearing out from its seat. Moving. Bearing free from the shaft. Now we're going to repeat the process with each gear as we go down. Woodruff keys out. We can slide our idler gear off of our input shaft. A little lesson in anatomy is that a little bit after the 156,000 serial number, a different type of idler gear was used. This was the idler gear from our earlier model 430, the 430 utility we took apart. It has a needle bearing in the inside, press fit in the gear. The later style has a thrust washer, followed by the gear. There's always a washer on the back side as well, another thrust washer. But these bearings are more of a roller style bearing on the inside of this gear. It's a loose fit versus the press fit or the earlier style. Depending on what bearings we're going to use, going to matter what gear we use. Put that back together. Luckily the input shaft's always the same, so that part will not matter. Today we're going to go on a little adventure to dig up some spare transmission parts. I'm going to take a little trip here through the barn. Got Amish Dave's horse over there. Kind of have to weave through all sorts of clutter. Get kind of in the back, dark, scary portions of the shed here, but in my experience, that's where a lot of the good stuff tends to be found. So we're going to work our way up over here to where I have a couple spare transmissions stashed away. And I do believe that both of these are utility transmissions. This one's a live power transmission. This one I think is just non-live, just regular But what I'm wanting to see is how our ring and pinions look as far as our gear sets. I'm going to pull the back cover off this one. It'll give us a good look at our ring gear, maybe even our pinion up in there to see if it's a good substitute for the one in our 430 that has a little bit of wear. Analysis of our first option doesn't seem to be any better than what we already have. We've got some wear marks on our ring gear teeth, and there's actually even a little line that kind of runs up where the pinion and the ring gear meet, almost as if there's been some wear to the teeth over time. No chips or anything like that, but the backlash seems a little excessive. As far as when I've set these in the past, I don't remember there being that much backlash back and forth. So there may be more wear in this one than's worth digging into. So we're going to pop our cover back on, maybe see what we've got with option number 2. Well, it took a little bit of flexibility, but I was able to get up into the back of our second transmission. And our ring gear still has some marks on the teeth, but the backlash feels a little bit better to me. The gear lash, you can see this doesn't move near as much as what that previous transmission did that we looked in. So we're just going to go ahead and take this one all the way apart, and we're going to make the best of what we got between the two to put our little 430 back together. Here we have the contents of transmission number 2 out in the daylight. Our little John Deere 430 transmission is disassembled. I've spent some time cleaning up all the components that we're going to need or use to put everything back together. All the gears, shafts, flanges, castings, all nice and sanitary now. Probably going to stop the video here as a part 1 disassembly. In part 2 we'll cover, of course, reassembly, putting in new bearings, replacing all the shafts and gears, all the things that make this thing go. There will be setting preload on bearings, clearances for the ring and pinion, some fun stuff that I'm sure you'll want to check back in for. So hope to see you for part 2.